For natural selection to gain traction, Darwin had to build a body of scientific evidence to overcome the firmly rooted religious ideas about evolution that dominated at the time. Video 2.2 discusses Darwin's scientific evidence to support natural selection, as well as a competing idea, that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. I want you to be able to meet these two goals. Pause for a closer look. Let's start by talking about a competing theory for Darwin, Lamarck's theory of evolution by acquired traits. Lamarck's theory was actually published in 1809, the year Darwin was born, and I want you to think of Lamarck's description of the evolution process as the theory of acquired traits. Lamarck's basic principles were, first, the idea that use and disuse affects traits. In other words, traits become enhanced or diminished by how the organisms use or not use their traits. The second is inheritance of acquired traits. This means that traits developed during an organism's lifetime can be passed down to its offspring. Let's learn more about Lamarck using his classic example of why giraffes have long necks. Giraffes' long necks are advantageous to reach their food source of leaves high in trees. Now, Lamarck proposed that since giraffes use and stretch their neck to constantly reach for higher and higher leaves, giraffe necks gets slightly longer during their life, and then that slightly longer neck would be passed on to their offspring. Now, this doesn't mean that giraffes went from having shorter necks to long necks in just one generation. Instead, Lamarck hypothesized that the lengthening took many generations. And in each generation, giraffes stretch their neck for food, those giraffes' necks get longer than before, and then they pass those longer than before necks to their offspring. So with each generation, the necks just get a little bit longer. We know now that Lamarck's theory was incorrect, but in 1809, his was the most accepted theory of evolution. Even though it was incorrect, the reason I want to talk about Lamarck is to highlight an important difference between Lamarck and Darwin. Lamarck postulated that giraffes developed longer necks during their lives and passed on those acquired longer necks to their offspring. Darwin said that giraffes are born with the variable characteristics of neck size. And in Darwin's theory, you get what you get at birth. And if you're lucky enough to have a naturally longer neck, then you'd pass on that longer neck that you were born with if that helped you survive the struggle of life. Let's look at that another way. Lamarck would say that individuals can change during their lives and that individuals live and reproduce based on traits that they have at birth or develop during their lifetime. But both types of traits, the born with traits and the acquired traits, can be passed on. Now, in Darwin's theory, organisms are only selected to survive and reproduce based on the traits that they're born with. Sure, organisms' behaviors and physiology can change, but only the only traits organisms can pass on are the traits they're born with. One thing that both agreed on, however, is the pace of evolution. Both understood that evolution took millions of years. The idea that Earth was so old defied widespread religious beliefs of the time. Hopefully this blacksmith can debunk Lamarck's ideas in your mind once and for all. He's a big dude with big muscles from blacksmithing all day with his big hammer and his big mug. And this guy's hammer arm muscles would get huge during his lifetime, use and disuse. The blacksmith would acquire big arms, and those big muscles would be passed on to his offspring, right? Not really. Children of blacksmith families don't look like this with a big old hammer arm when they're born, so Lamarck's theory doesn't exactly hold up to scientific evidence. Here's the thing, though. Lamarck's ideas were critical to advancing scientific thought. His ideas shook the foundation of religious beliefs. He stressed that species were not created perfectly by a divine power, but changed over time. Lamarck knew that natural environments had a role in changing species. And finally, Lamarck really pushed the idea that the evolution process takes a really long time. When Darwin rolled out natural selection, he had four main lines of supporting scientific evidence: artificial selection, island biogeography, fossils, and homologous anatomical structures. Artificial selection is when man selects breeders to shape organisms that meet human needs. A classic example of artificial selection is domestic dogs. I don't know if you know this, but all dogs originated from wolves that were first domesticated like 12 to 15,000 years ago. And by humans selecting dogs with extreme characteristics to match certain jobs, people created all of these different diverse breeds of domesticated dogs. And in nature, the process of evolution usually takes millions of years, but artificial selection accelerates that process of shaping species. Another example of artificial selection in agriculture is selective breeding of wild mustard to make all of these different types of vegetables we have today. Cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kale, and kohlrabi, is that how you say that? Are all descendants from many generations of artificial selection of the same plant. So artificial selection and natural selection are related processes. Both select which organisms get to be breeders, but the selection pressure is different. In artificial selection, people select breeders to shape the species for specific jobs, whereas in natural selection, natural conditions select breeders, and that shapes the species to better fit those natural conditions. Either way, the species changes over time, and the critical difference is the amount of time that it takes, shown down here. Since man uses such extreme and aggressive selection, artificial selection rapidly accelerates the pace of change by orders of magnitude. So Darwin knew people would have a hard time getting on board with natural selection, which can take millions of years, but transformation of wolves into dogs and selective breeding of wild mustard was part of documented human history. And by laying out the similarities of artificial and natural selection, Darwin helped people see the role of selection in shaping species over time. Man's aggressive selection causes evolution in a short time that people would understand, so why can't nature cause evolution with a longer time frame? Darwin's next line of evidence is island biogeography. Island biogeography refers to the geographic distribution of species. In the Galapagos Islands that are shown here, Darwin found many endemic species, or certain species found only on certain islands. Darwin found that different islands had closely related species to each other and to the South American mainland. Famous examples include Darwin's finches and Galapagos tortoises. Even though these species are closely related, each has adaptations to increase their fitness for their specific island. Finch beaks adapted over time to fit each island's food source, as shown here, and the shells of Galapagos tortoises match up with their food source too. This tortoise has a saddleback shell, allowing the tortoise to reach much higher for food that's higher up. In other words, species evolve over time to match their environmental conditions. Darwin used island biogeography, endemic species, to show that species match up with their natural conditions to survive best. Closely related species have specific adaptations that fit the features of their different environment. In other words, Darwin used island biogeography to emphasize the role of nature in shaping a species' evolution. The next piece of scientific evidence from Darwin is fossils. To decode the information that fossils are trying to tell you, you need to understand the law of superposition. The law of superposition says that older fossils are on the bottom and more recent fossils are on the top in rock layers. This means that fossils in an area can be organized to make a timeline of evolution. Darwin anticipated pushback against natural selection because people can't see evolution. And the reason why people can't see evolution is because evolution takes a long time, usually millions of years. So for Darwin, using the scientific evidence of fossils created a timeline for evolution that people could see. Lining up fossils like these horse fossils allowed people to see a timeline of millions of years with their own eyes and believe that evolution by natural selection takes a really long time. In other words, fossils helped establish the timeline of millions of years for natural selection to occur. The last line of scientific evidence is homologous anatomical structures. Now, homologous structures are structures in different species that have common evolutionary origins. And the classic example is a forelimb or arm. So here are forelimbs from humans and cats and whales and bats. Now, the internal structures are very similar. Each has a humerus bone, a radius bone, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And what's different, though, are the proportions and shapes of these bones among the different species. Here's the thing though, each species uses its forelimb differently. Humans use arms for grasping, cats depend on their front paws for walking, whales use their flippers for swimming, and bat forelimbs are wings for flying. And even though the underlying structures are the same, the structures have evolved over millions of years to fit the natural needs of that species to survive in its environment. All right, so these species had the same building blocks, all these arm bones, and that's a good indicator that they're all related. But over time, the building blocks were shaped to be suitable for unique environmental conditions. Again, Darwin's evidence shows the role of nature in natural selection. Now, today, scientists use homologous structures as the gold standard to show relatedness, but they use molecular homology instead of anatomical homology. DNA and RNA and protein sequences are known for many species, and scientists compare the sequences to piece together the story of evolution. Unfortunately for Darwin, these molecules weren't well understood during his lifetime, so molecular homology was not evidence that Darwin could use. So let's recap. Lamarck had an incorrect but important theory to explain evolution based on acquired traits. Now, to correct the wrong parts of Lamarck's theory, Darwin used 4 lines of scientific evidence in support of natural selection. Artificial selection showed people how selecting breeders can shape species. The role of nature in evolution by natural selection was shown using the evidence of island biogeography and homologous structures. And finally, people had a hard time wrapping their heads around a timeline of millions of years, so Darwin's evidence of fossils helped people see what millions of years of change look like right in front of their eyes.